Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good night's sleep and that you're all rested because it's promising to be a very interesting day with some very interesting talks, with this being the first one. Um, I would like to start with an article that has been published by Harvard Business Review. They did a survey on AI-enabled transformation, and they had about 300 respondents in all continents of the world. And they asked these people about artificial intelligence in organizations. I would like to highlight two things about that survey. First, 71% of these organizations think that AI or machine learning will become extremely important in the next coming 18 to 24 months. This is okay, but still we are aiming for a higher percentage, of course, but it's still okay. If you then take a look at the second percentage, it's saying that 61% of these organizations have a data strategy in place. Of course, this is very problematic. 61% is very high. So I think you can already assume what I will be talking about today. I'm Ben. I recently joined DataRoots as a data strategist, and I will be talking about how to create a business-driven data strategy for different operating models in businesses. So it might be a complex title, but quite a long title. So what I will first do is I will do a breakdown of the title by zooming in on the aspects business-driven, data strategy, and operating models. And afterwards, we'll dive deeper into the approach of creating or developing a data strategy. So first, business-driven. As you can see, data strategy should work toward maximizing business impact. Businesses have certain goals. For example, a goal could be that we want to have a better customer service, and a concrete goal would then be that our net promoter score should increase with 10 points in the next coming 12 months. Now, of course, we will also need to define a business strategy, so really a plan on how we will go to reach those goals. And when we created the business strategy, only then we start thinking about how data or AI will help us in making the business strategy even stronger and better by implementing some data or AI algorithms and to make it a stronger strategy. Now, I could have placed the data strategy below the business strategy because it's an outcome or it's a next step. But in my opinion, it's very important to have them together, so next to each other. Why? Because it's really necessary to have strategic alignment between the two of them. And ideally, there's only just one strategy, so that would be really the North Star, and that the strategy is about business, but also intertwined with the data strategy. So everything that we do should be data-driven in an ideal way. The business strategy will drive the data strategy, but the data strategy will empower the business strategy. Now, I already said data strategy a lot, so maybe to clear things up, I want to give a definition on data strategy, or at least how we see it at DataRoots. At DataRoots, we see data strategy as a definition of an action plan to advance the data and AI maturity of a company towards a North Star ambition. So, of course, companies develop new goals throughout the years. They will develop a new business strategy, and every time they will develop a new data strategy as well. And the goal is, with each iteration, to go a bit closer towards the North Star ambition. And in my opinion, in that North Star ambition, as shown in the previous slide, the data and business strategy are fully intertwined. And then something about operating models, because each one of you is working in a certain company, and all companies have a different structure, a different organization model. And we can see that this impacts the development of the data strategy as well. So most companies will lie in a gray area between centralized and decentralized, but I will highlight these two as a white and black to give a clear overview of the differences of both of them. So at the left, you can see a centralized organization or operating model. And there you can see that objectives are created in a corporate manner, so company-wide and top-down. And only then they get translated towards certain domains, such as marketing, finance, and so on. And we can also see that all domains are using the same centralized capabilities. Now, if you take a look at a decentralized company, you can see that the differences are highlighted. Then we can see that they work more bottom up. Why? Because it's very domain driven. So each domain is accountable and responsible for their strategy, their goals, and what they will do as a domain. Only then it gets aligned, and then the corporate objectives will be defined. Another thing is because these domains are very domain-driven and accountable and responsible for their own capabilities, that capabilities are shared, but only one domain is owner of that capability. So again, more alignment is necessary, but also it's more flexible. So I will take this into account throughout the whole journey of creating the data strategy, but it's just something to keep in mind. Then we can go to the 5 steps of developing a data strategy. First, we need to understand the business goals. As I mentioned, business driven. Then we need to discover use cases. Then we will analyze the roles and capabilities of the company. Then we will prioritize and evaluate the use cases that have been defined previously. And finally, when we decided on which use cases we want to use in our company, then we will plot it on a roadmap, give a timing on it, responsibilities, and so on. Now, you might be thinking you forgot about something. Of course, data governance and data architecture are super important during the whole process as well. But it's not one step. Actually, it should be managed in parallel with the whole development of the data strategy because it's part of every step in the process. I will not focus on data governance and data architecture today, but today we will focus on the right side of the slide, which is really an A to Z development plan for the data strategy. So maybe start with the business goals then. As I mentioned, company can, for example, have business goals on customer experience, operation excellence, and so on. And except for the objectives and strategy, it's also very important to keep in mind the KPIs, the mission and the vision of the company, and as mentioned before, also the organizational structure. Now, already in the beginning of the development of the data strategy, you can see a clear difference between centralized and decentralized companies. In centralized companies, these things will be developed by the corporate team or management team on top of the company, while in a decentralized company, the strategy and objectives and the KPIs and so on will be more developed within the domains themselves. So there are a bit more interdependencies, but both have advantages and disadvantages, and I will come back on that at the end of the presentation. Then we need to discover use cases. So imagine that we have certain goals and we have a business strategy. Of course, we will think about, okay, how is data going to help us in making this even stronger or in driving really the business strategy. So what we will do first is have an idea on all the business goals and think about who are all the stakeholders of these business goals, because they know why we are doing it, what is important and what is not, and so on. So we will have to facilitate workshops, we will facilitate brainstorm sessions, and so on, to really make a backlog of use cases. Now, to make it a bit more tangible, I added some use cases on which Data Roots has been working in the past. You can see the examples on the right side of the slide. And important also here is to always make a reflection. For example, when a use case is executed in a certain domain or in the company, other domains may benefit as well from that use case. So it might not only be good to execute the use case for the specific goal itself, but also for other things. So it's also very important to make that reflection. It's important to do that in both centralized and decentralized companies, but in decentralized companies, it's a bit more of a challenge because you have to know about the other domains, what their objectives are, and how they are seeing the vision of their domain in the future. Yeah, maybe also to add on that, here in a decentralized company, the use cases will be developed per domain, whereas in a centralized company, they will more look at it on a helicopter view and develop use cases on the full company. Now, once we know which use cases we want to execute or are possible to execute, we have to take into account the as-is situation of the company, but also already think about the to-be situation when we would execute those use cases. So first of all, the people, the resources of the company, how many data people do we have in our organization? For example, do we have 5 data scientists or 20 data scientists? How many data engineers do we have? How many CRM experts do we have? And so on. But also, who are the data stewards? So in terms of data governance, who are the business owners, and so on. It's really important to get an idea on that because they will be the ones who are driving the use cases, of course. And then next to that, of course, also the capabilities. Do we have a data platform on which we can execute these use cases? Do we have the right data assets and so on? And that way we can really think about whether or not it will be feasible to execute the use case, yes or no. Again, here in a centralized company, data assets will be shared, so it's very transparent. But in domain-driven companies or decentralized companies, we have already seen that sometimes domain X can use, for example, AWS, and domain Y can use, for example, Azure. So the technology stack can be a bit scattered, and therefore, again, there are some dependencies, but it's also more flexible. Now, I could have reversed it and start with analyzing our as a situation and only then start thinking about the use cases, because then we already know which technology is in place and which people could help us. But actually in brainstorm sessions or workshops, it's very important to start with a clear mind and to not have these constraints yet. So therefore, we first think about the use case backlog, and only then we start thinking about the as is situation of the roles and the capabilities. Now, we have the list of use cases. We know as a situation of our technology and capability and people. Now we have to take into account 3 things. First of all, the business rationale, so the business goals that we've been talking about already. It's grayed out a bit because it's already within the use cases, because the use cases are developed based on these goals. But it's still important to think about the strategic importance when we are evaluating the use cases. So even though that it's already implemented in the use case, it's still important to think about the strategic importance. Next to that, we have the resources and the capabilities of what I've been talking about in the previous slide. And thirdly, which is, of course, to the business super important, how much can we earn by doing this? What is the benefit of making all of this data-driven? So we have to think about the euros of it. And when we take all of this together, we can plot these use cases on the feasibility value matrix. As the name suggests, there are 2 axes. First, the business value. In between brackets, there's a euro, but it's not only about the euros, because sometimes something can have a very high cost and less profit, but still is very important to have it. For example, if we want to make our brand image better, or if we want to build a certain platform which can be important in the future, and so on. So we don't have to only look at the euros, but also at the strategic importance. And these 2 will then give a high or a low score on the use case. Then on the second axis, we have the feasibility. That's more related towards the people and capabilities, what is shown before. For example, if there's still a capability to be built for a use case, it might be too expensive or too slow, and then it might be a bit less feasible. Or when the use case needs 10 data scientists and 5 data engineers, and we just don't have them, then of course the feasibility will be a bit lower. Now you can see the strategic initiatives where the business value is high, but the technical feasibility is low. How can we shift them towards easy wins or towards use cases that are attractive? Well, we could have, for example, 1 use case in the easy win for which we need to develop a certain capability, but it could be the fact that there are 3 use cases in the strategic initiatives which share the same capability. So it might be a bigger capability to build, but if we build it, we can execute 3 use cases instead of 1. So that way we can play a bit around with the use cases, and we have to really think strategically about this. We also have the revising later. These are things that are technically feasible, but are not yet strategic important enough, or just don't bring enough money in the bank. But for example, if we have a new product launch, or we can see that the competitor is investing a lot in a certain area and we need to do it as well, then the strategic importance can, of course, rise, and then it can become an easy win as well. So context is really important here. In a centralized company, this will be done top-down again. So it will be really above all domains. We will decide on which use cases will be developed, and only then we will translate it into tasks for the domains. In a decentralized company, it depends on the domain, how they rate strategic importance and how they think about technical feasibility and so on. So there's a big difference between those two operating models. So we thought about the business goals, we thought about backlog of use cases, we took an as-is situation of the company, and then we plotted it on the value feasibility matrix. So now we really have a prioritized list of, it's there, you can see it, but it's not on the screen. Okay, it's a bit slower. So we have a prioritized use case list. Now what we have to do is, of course, plot it on a timeline so that we can make sure that responsibilities are assigned and that we know when and how we will execute these use cases. This is a very, very simplistic overview because it's not a session on road mapping, but on data strategy. So what you can see here is that for each use case, we will define a timeline. We will start with, you can actually relate it to CRISP DM. I don't know if you know it, but you start with data collection, stakeholder meetings, then you start building, you start testing, and so on. And what I want to mention here, first of all, the difference between centralized and decentralized companies, because in a centralized company, the roadmap will be created company-wide, and there will be a lot of fighting for resources and capabilities and so on. In a decentralized company, each domain will be accountable for his roadmap. But then again, we have the interdependencies because, of course, they share some capabilities and a lot of communication is necessary. So it's a bit more of a challenge. Now, how can we make the roadmap a bit smarter or better? Is by thinking about shared capabilities. I already talked about this within the prioritization exercise. But for example, when we take the 3 use cases with the shared capability, it can be important to take one of those at the start of the roadmap, because then we can take a bit more time to develop the tooling foundation. And then when the new use case will make use of this tooling, it will take less effort and time to have the tooling ready for that use case. Okay, so we have gone through all 5 steps. I already talked a lot about the differences between centralized and decentralized. So let's wrap it up a bit and go through the advantages and disadvantages. For centralized, first of all, there's full control because it's top-down. It's developed within a certain group of people. And of course, then there's also a lot of clear alignment because domains know what they are up to. It gets translated from top to domain. And also there's a clear overview because everyone knows what is happening. Everyone knows what they are doing. And that gives a very clear overview. Now, there are also some disadvantages on this. So first of all, the risk for the ivory tower, because I mentioned top-down a lot, there's a certain group of people, which of course with input from the company, but they just decide on what is important and what not. And this can bring a risk of the ivory tower. Also the risk for a bottleneck, because if you're working centralized and there are a lot of use cases, capacity may be an issue, while in a decentralized company, you can share it and there's a lot of bandwidth within each domain, and that way there's less risk for the bottleneck. And it's also less flexible. If you then take a look at the domain-driven or the decentralized companies, we can see that it's very pragmatic because it's very hands-on. It's domain-driven, and therefore also all people within that domain have a very high affinity. They're responsible and accountable for everything they do. They work on a daily basis on the topics for that domain. So they might be better in estimating what is important for them and what is not. So this is a huge advantage, of course. But there are also some disadvantages. First of all, the interdependencies. For example, in the prioritization or in the creation of the backlog of use cases, but also in the road mapping, it's really necessary to have a lot of communication to understand what the other domains are up to, but also in terms of capacity, resourcing, and so on. So that could be a disadvantage. And I have to look at it. Yeah, less control. Yeah, it's the opposite of the full control that we have at centralized. And of course, also the longer communication lines, because there's no clear hierarchy, it's not waterfall, and so on. So I would like to ask to you, what are your main takeaways? There are 3 takeaways I have ready, that I have prepared. So I would like to ask if you have some.
Use cases at scale, so trying to combine resources for use cases and not just looking at every use case individually.
It's a very good one. I didn't add it here, but it's actually a very good one. The ones that I have is that, first of all, we need to create a data strategy to make sure that the maturity of the data and the AI within the organization becomes better and better towards a North Star ambition. Secondly, always think business first, because a lot of engineers and data people are willing to put a lot of time and effort into the most fancy and best AI algorithm. But we have to think about the business goals first, and then think about what is necessary to reach those goals. And it might be a model that is not super fancy or that requires a lot of effort and time. So that's really a mind shift that I really want you to make. I really want to install a mindset of thinking business first. And then thirdly, I have to spit a bit. Always keep in mind, yeah, of course, it's throughout the whole presentation, I put effort in explaining it. So always keep in mind the operating model and the organizational structure of your company, because you have to know who is making the decisions, why the decisions are made that way, and how your decisions can impact the creation of the data strategy and the machine learning and AI efforts. So thank you a lot to come listen to this presentation. If you have some questions online, I think you can ask them in chat. And if you have some questions, you can ask them too. Do we have some questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.